I'm with the co-chair of the Coalition for Open Democracy, which is one of the proud sponsors of this event. We were a group started by Brandy D. Hedrick to, yes. We get inspired every day. As a matter of fact, on our board, we say, what would Brandy do when we come to a decision point? But it's, we're working hard to get the dirty, big money out of our politics and out of our democracy, so we can have no more, not a dollarocracy, but a democracy, a republic of the people, not of the 0.11%. Okay, I will try to. Is that better? Sorry. All right. It was, maybe it wasn't that great stuff anyway. But it is very inspiring to see you here. I'm afraid it's very inspiring that so many groups, like Arnie Alpert was saying, are coming to the same conclusion from different ways. We have very little time. We've got to turn things around. This is not a joke anymore. And we have, for example, Larry Lessig has been going around the state. I hope you get to see him in terms of he's coming at it from the same way. We've got to get the money out. We've got to get public funding. We've got to stop this. I do have the distinct privilege today of having a very famous author, I think who you all know, introduce a very famous author. So, unfortunately, what's happened is he missed his train. And, of course, part of the problem we have is we don't have any trains, so it was easy to miss. I think the last train in Peterborough was that boxcar that went through the A&P, which is now the toadstool. Some of you remember that when the line was still there. But I was disappointed he couldn't make this special introduction of our very special guest tonight. And I think you all kind of.
Well, hold on now, hold on. I'm taking it.
Wait a minute.
I'm not coming back here. Yes. What do you do with these trains around here? They stop and go, and stop and go. I said to the conductor, what are you doing with the cattle catcher on the front of the train? You should put it on the back of the train to keep the cows from mopping up. And I'm going to introduce this man. I understand you call him a great author. You're seeing a great author, yeah.
Public transportation is bad, I guess. He made it, so here he is.
Yeah. I'm coming.
Now, do you know what this thing is here?
Yes, it's a big toothpick. You must have
a big toothpick. So the thing is, you need to put the toothpick close to your tooth.
Right, yes. A fine set of teeth that young man has.
Mark,
too.
go home, Mark.
Yes. Well, I'm pleased to be in this handsome, wonderful church. I've come quite a distance. Yes. Some people might think that I came down. Other people might think I came up. Yes. I'm reminded of the story back in Hades of Satan talking to a fellow down there. And he's telling this fellow, anybody here from Chicago? Well, you'll understand this completely. He's telling this fellow from Chicago, don't think you're any better than anybody else down here. You're just more numerous. Yes. So, you understand, right? Yes. Okay. Well, I have the distinct privilege of introducing a fellow author. And so I don't know this fellow personally, and I don't know his work very well. But by all reputes, he's a great author. And you see, he's called, it's a strange name for an author, Hedrick Smith. Yes. Yes. I guess only in a Universalist church will you ask a fellow like Hedrick Smith to come, but the Unitarian Universalists are interesting if nothing else. I'll tell you that. You know, I was brought up Presbyterian. Yes. And I could remember when I went out with my older brother out west, and I got some advice from the Presbyterian minister who knew me well. And he said, Sam, you're going out west now. And you know, there's a lot of saloons and drinking out there. And there's a lot of gambling. And there's a lot of women like, you know, my kind of women. And he went on this long list. And he concluded by saying, and so, Sam, it's going to be very hard to remain a good Presbyterian boy out there. Yes, and I didn't for long. No, not for long at all. Well, this heretic fellow has written a book about dreaming, and so I've had my own dreams, and by all reputes, he's a good author, and I hope so. We're going to find out. And the world is losing its great authors, you know. Yeah, that Chaucer, long. Milton, noble. Shakespeare, it's great. And I'm not feeling so well myself, you know. But this other fellow apparently is spry as a chicken, clucking away, I guess. But we'll see what he has to share. But I guess I better get on with this business pretty soon. So you hear actually from him. Unfortunately. So it's with great privilege that I refer to this heretic, this fellow Smith that sounds like an alias to me. But in any event, I believe that I know two things unimpeachably about Mr. Smith. He's never been to jail. And two, I don't know why. That's true. But always remember, it's not the how big the dog is in a fight, but how big the fight is in the dog. And I think this fellow has plenty of fight in himself and in his books. So without further ado, I hand this toothpick to Hedrick Smith. Yes.
Hedrick Smith says hello to Mark Twain. Let me just tell you what a delight it is to be not just in this church with you all tonight, but to be in New Hampshire. We have somehow crammed about a dozen events in the last 3 days, from Gibson's bookstore to We the People over in Exeter, to talk with UNH and up to Plymouth State. And I have to tell you this morning, I had one of the most delightful mornings I could have had anywhere in Nashua Public High School, with probably 60 advanced placement students in sociology and American history and politics, talking about America today. And I want to tell you, almost everywhere I go, with audiences like this, people ask me somewhere along the way, well, what are we going to do? How can you count on the younger generation? They're just not interested, they're just not concerned, they're just not very bright. But I want to tell you, those kids were bright as heck. They were totally engaged, listening every minute, back and forth, asking me questions, pouring up at the end of the talk to talk to me. And I got to tell you, it just lifted my heart, made me feel great. And I just want to share that with you. You have a special state, you know that. I've been up here, I can't tell you how many times covering presidential elections. I think the last time I was in your good town was with my son, who was a rare book collector, and we walked up Mount Monadnock, hiked up Mount Monadnock. we came down, we went over to the Toadstool bookstore over here, and went inside. He poked around, and I think he found a couple of books that he thought were interesting. And just to be in your town is a delight again. You have such a charming place to be, and it's so gorgeous outside. And the shame is that this bubbling enthusiasm of the young and this gorgeous beauty of the outside and the charm of your town and your bright faces isn't reflected in the state of our country. It's disturbing. It's distressing. It's no secret to anybody that our country's in a lot of trouble. And it's not just because we've had a government shutdown for the last 16 days. But you all having trouble seeing me in the back, but I'm not used to being up. Pulpits are not places journalists are used to being. But I think, and I'm going to mess you up, Herb, by coming up here.
You're okay.
I can't take the high pulpit. I got a nosebleed up there. Maybe Mark Twain can go up there. He's up there with you know who, or maybe he's down in the other place with the other Anyway, we're in trouble, and we're in deep trouble. We're not in small trouble. I wish I could make light of it. If I were making light of it, I would recall that favorite cartoon of mine, the Peanuts. It's the one where Lucy has a card table set up in the backyard. It says psychiatry 1 cent. Well, you know who comes up, Charlie Brown. He comes up and he puts his penny down, and Lucy says, Charlie, before I can give you any advice, he said, I need to have you think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Now, there's some people who take their deck chair into the bow, and they look into the future to see where they're going. And there are other people that take their deck chair and they take it to the stern, and they look back to see where they've come from. Which group do you belong to? Charlie thought a moment, scratched his head, he pawed the dirt with his foot, and he said, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded. So that's one way of looking at sort of where we are. Congress is certainly having a lot of trouble getting its chair unfolded these days, there's no question about that. But there's another slant on this, a little bit more serious slant. Comment of John Gardner, who was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, founded Common Cause. You remember John Gardner. He died a few years ago, but before he died, and it's interesting, before he died, he was talking about this in about 2004. He had this to say: we are treading the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people doubt their society, the whole venture falls apart. We must never let anger, fashionable cynicism, or political partisanship blur our vision on that point. We must not despair of the Republic. Well, we know it. We're a badly divided society today. I just heard the minister talk about Chuck Collins coming here talking about the 1% and the 99% sometime soon, the next few days. I'm on that same theme myself. We have enormous inequalities, enormous divisions in income. We have enormous divisions in power in America today. And we have other schisms and other divisions. Abraham Lincoln warned us a long time ago, a house divided cannot stand. And that old professor, that old scholar of world history, Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian who wrote a 12-volume history of the civilizations of the world, 21 civilizations in over 6,000 years, was commenting about how civilizations meet the challenges that they face, and those who can meet them successfully rise and continue and sustain themselves, and those that can't fall. And he talks about a variety of challenges: the challenge of the environment to ancient Egypt, the challenge of a hostile environment to the Inca civilization in Peru. And they overcame that, and they were able to set up agricultural societies and economies that thrive, and were able to not only thrive, but generate such wealth that they've left behind temples that many of us in the modern world still go to see. The Sphinx in Egypt, the pyramids, the temples of Machu Picchu in Peru. But they fell to another challenge, the military challenge of the Ottoman Turks in the case of Egypt, and the Spanish in the case of the Peruvian Incas. So there's an external challenge, and we know something about external challenges. We met the challenge of Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese in World War II. And we met the challenge for half a century in the Cold War of Soviet communism challenging us both ideologically, economically, politically, militarily around the world. We met those challenges. But what's fascinating and instructive about Toynbee for us today is that Toynbee suggests that some of the most difficult challenges which shred and eventually shred apart the two civilizations that we most admire in ancient history, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, are challenges from within the society. Ancient Greece fell apart, the city-states fell apart, fighting, warring among themselves about internal trade among the city-states. In ancient Rome, we begin with Brutus against Caesar, and then Pompey against Caesar, and then it carries on, and finally, at the core in Rome, it falls apart because of divisions in the middle. And that reminds me of America today. Toynbee talks about schisms in the body social, schisms in the soul of a society as being potentially fatal. It seems to me we run perilously close today unless we can find a way to heal them, overcome them, and begin to deal with them and to deal with our problems as a society. We are at that perilous moment when schisms of the soul and schisms of the body social may tear this country apart and set it on a path that is inevitably in decline. I don't think any of us wants that. We certainly don't want it for our generation. Looking around this audience, like me, you don't want it for your kids, and you certainly don't want it for your grandchildren. We don't want that to be our legacy to them, putting our civilization on a downward path. And I think we face that problem. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about how we might reclaim the American dream and regenerate the energy and the coherence in our society. And I don't think we can get to that point until we really can understand well why we are at the point we're at and why we're in the predicament that we're in. I think back to the period when I came out of college, and I went to college not far from here at Williams in Western Massachusetts. It seemed to me that at that time we had a workable society, a fairly fair society, a society in which prosperity was pretty widely shared. Was it perfectly shared? We certainly had poverty, we certainly had ups and downs in our economy, and the things that people have today, all kinds of electronic gadgets, second cars, larger houses and so forth, that we didn't have then. And certainly women have advanced and have moved higher up in our political system and higher up in our economic system than before. But generally speaking, in terms of economics, we had fairly widely shared prosperity, and we had a political system that worked. Yes, the Democrats and the Republicans fought. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were on the opposite side of things. But it's unbelievable. They actually passed budgets. Do you remember the day when they actually passed budgets? And passing a budget didn't mean just passing one piece of legislation. It actually means passing 14 pieces of legislation. One budget and 13 separate appropriations bills to appropriate the money to run the different departments in the federal government. We passed programs that enable us to send a man to the moon when we saw the challenge from the Soviet Union of Sputnik. Well, that took bipartisan support, and it took sustained support. We had far-flung military all around the world. We supported that. We passed civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Law of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We passed Medicare and Medicaid, and on, a whole variety of programs. This got done. The business of government, the business of the nation, not perfectly, but we moved forward. We didn't say stuck, stuttering, as we do now in Washington, stuck in the polarization of gridlock. And we need to get beyond that. So there was a different time then. Well, what happened between then and now? When I look at the economy in particular, I see a couple of things that happened to our economy and to our political system that affected our economy and generated what Citigroup, not just liberal economists, not just Keynesian economists, but Citigroup called the greatest inequality of wealth and income in any major country since 16th century Spain. This is Citigroup talking about us today, 16th century Spain. That means we haven't seen that great inequality of wealth in any major country in 500 years. That's a long time. That's a hell of a record. And when I heard somebody outside, I'm sorry I didn't see who it was, I was waiting in the back hall for Mark Twain to call me in, but I heard somebody saying, the situation's perilous, it's not a joke, we need to deal with it. It is perilous, it is not a joke, we do need to deal with it. So what happened? from that old situation, and did I remember it right? Or as one of those white-haired guys, and I see a few other people around the room showing my hair, do I have a bit of nostalgia here? Am I seeing things with rosy glasses? Hey, Smith, are you just sort of saying, well, in the old days, things were really good. When I was young, they really made men, men, and women, women, and the children were all above everything. We're back to Lake Wobegon. Is that Lake Wobegon time? Might be. Better go check yourself on that. Well, I went back and I took a look. I did some study. In fact, I worked for a solid year doing research and reporting before I wrote the first word of this book. And one of the things I found out was that, in fact, I was right. There was pretty widely shared income and pretty widely shared prosperity. From the end of World War II until the middle of the 1970s, the productivity of the American workforce roughly doubled. It went up 97%. And the income of the median American family, the people right in the middle of American society, the household income of that family, of those families, went up 95%. So almost dollar for dollar, the gains of the economy, the profits of the companies, the efficiency of the economy was translated into a rising living standard for people in the middle. Pretty darn important. It wasn't just people at the top, it was people in the middle. Economists like to divide society up into quintiles, the top 20%, second 20%, so on down to the bottom 20%. And if you look at all 5 of those quintiles from 1945 to the mid-70s, every single one of them experienced an increase in household income. In fact, what's interesting is the ones that, and they move up, oh, and it looks like a musical score, except it's a wavy one, because musical scores go like this, and economics always go kind of like this. But I'm sorry, you should do it your way so you can see it. Paint the picture a little bit more properly. Anyway, what's interesting is the bottom 2 quintiles actually rose a little bit faster than the others, and the top quintile actually rose a little bit slower. So that in fact we had a slight convergence from the people at the top and the people at the bottom of our income pot. So it turned out that I was right. Well, what happened to that? Well, one of the things that happened that's interesting is that there was a power shift in Washington. Now, before that, there was a power shift, and I don't mean the Democrats beat the Republicans or the Republicans beat the Democrats. I mean there was a seismic shift in the major forces that were moving the politics and the policies of America. If you look at the period that I'm talking about, particularly the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, the middle class of America was active and engaged politically in a whole series of movements that affected the policies that came out of Washington. Very important for us today because it's not going on today very much. Okay? So we need to think about that. We need to take a look at that period, and we need to draw some lessons from that. At least that's what I think, if we're going to reclaim the American dream. Think about it. 50 years ago today, Betty Friedan wrote this Feminine Mystique. And women began protesting that it was unfair for women to be paid 41 cents on the dollar for doing the same work that men were doing. They went around, they protested, they marched, they had demonstrations, they had speakers. They went braless to be on our faces and say, listen guys, take a look at us. Not that sexy way, but we're here as people and perceive us and give us a break. And they put pressure on the economic system, they put pressure on the political system, and in 1963, John F. Kennedy, as president, signed the first piece of national legislation that began to say you cannot have inequality of income based on gender for the same work. Very important. We're not there yet. Women are now at 77 cents on the dollar for the same work that men are doing. But it's a long way better than it was. But my point is, women didn't just sit there and talk to each other in the coffee shops and say, you know, this is wrong, and shake their heads, or go to church and nod their heads at a minister or a speaker like me. They got up and they demonstrated. I started covering the civil rights movement in 1960 in February. I met John Lewis when he was a student at Union Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was a reporter for United Press International. And the kids came out of the churches there in the beginning of those nonviolent demonstrations, and they marched downtown in their Sunday suits, 2 by 2, and and sat down at the lunch counters at Woolworth and Kresge and those old-fashioned dime store counters and said, we want a Coke and a hamburger just like everybody else. And they got beaten on, and they got arrested, and they got out of jail, and they came back and did it again and again and again. And they did it with the Freedom Rides. And I covered Martin Luther King in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama, and the March on Washington, which, by the way, was one of the greatest days of my life. It was a festival of freedom. There were 200,000 people, 200,000 people massed below that great statue of Lincoln, the Lincoln Memorial, looking back. Oh, I can see that crowd now looking back over the reflecting pool in Washington. And they were saying, not just I have a dream. They did say, he did say, I have a dream. To cash a promissory note from American democracy that all men and all women, yes, black men and black women, as well as white men and white women, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And within a year, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. And then there was a bloody demonstration at the voting rights march in Selma, Alabama. John Lewis and a bunch of others were literally clubbed into unconsciousness by Alabama state troopers. The nation was horrified by what it saw on the television sets. And once again, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. It wasn't that immediate, it wasn't that quick, but interestingly enough, it was very interesting. You know what happened? After the Civil Rights Act of 64 was passed, after Martin Luther King won his Nobel Prize, he came back through Washington. And Lyndon Johnson invited him to the White House. And he said to Lyndon Johnson at that point, President Johnson at that point, you know, we need a Voting Rights Act. And you know what Johnson said? He said, make me do it. And that's what happened. They went and demonstrated and made him do it. Now there's a very interesting interaction in that conversation and in what happened. Power in Washington, power in office, power on the streets, the interaction between people power and governmental power. Same thing as the women's movement. Consumer movement, triggered by Ralph Nader in that famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed, that said Detroit was making cars that were maiming people, killing people, causing accidents because the brakes failed or the steering column didn't work or the tires blew off. And there was a consumers movement that demanded better control of pharmaceuticals that came on the market, closer inspection of the meats and the chicken and the poultry and the pork that came on through the agricultural department. And more honest labeling and packaging of consumer products. Walk into a grocery store today, walk into a pharmacy today, think about what you're buying, wonder, should I get that shampoo, should I buy that particular cereal, whatever it is, turn it over on the back. And when you look at the contents of what's in that package, you can thank those people back in 1960, because prior to that, there were no labelings in the packages. It was people power that demanded a more effective government overseeing the fairness and effective operation of the market, not destroy the market, just make it fair and honest to the rest of us. That made the difference. There was a labor movement that had a lot of power, that negotiated with big companies like General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, and so on and so forth, bargained for decent wages, bargained for health care, bargained for retirement, for workers after they worked 30 or 40 years at the same. In 1980, 84% of the people who worked for companies with more than 100 employees had a guaranteed lifetime pension from their employer. A monthly check from the day you retired until the day you died, on top of Social Security. Today that number is 30%. 70% had fully paid employer health insurance. Today that number is 18%. Hear those numbers go down? That's taking away some of the security. Let me just tell you that when I started out working on this book, it wasn't called Who Stole the American Dream. It was called The Dream at Risk. Because I could see the dream was at risk. We were losing in 2009 500,000 jobs a month. People were being foreclosed out of their homes. Wall Street had collapsed. And the economy was headed for a cliff. But as I began to watch the decline in those benefits and the rise in the 401k, which brought about the transfer of cost for retirement, hundreds of billions of dollars a year shifted from the corporate books to the pocketbooks and the checkbooks of ordinary people. The dream is beginning As I got looking into the housing crisis, I discovered that ordinary homeowners lost $6 trillion in accumulated wealth, the equity they had in their homes during the housing boom, not in the collapse when the housing prices collapsed. Everybody lost something because the housing prices went down. But those who were in houses where they were refinancing their homes, they were taking out a second mortgage, more and more new buyers were getting 100% mortgages, didn't have anything down. In the late 1980s, American homeowners owned 88%. I'm sorry, in 1988, homeowners owned 70% of the value of their homes. In 2009, they owned 40% of the value of their homes. 30% of the value of all the housing in America in about 15 years moved from homeowners to banks and Wall Street investors. Biggest transfer of wealth in America's history. And it moved from ordinary people to the financial elite. We began to see 401k, decline in benefits, loss of $6 trillion. We began to think about a different title for my book. So what happened? How did that happen? What was going on? What was going on was a power shift. All those movements that I was talking about, the women's movement, the consumer movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, dear to people here in this part of New Hampshire. Gorgeous state that you have. Understandable. I happen to live both in Washington, D.C. and Washington State on Orcas Island, north of Seattle. Unbelievable beauty of nature which we wanted to protect. And what was going on in the 1960s and the 1970s was enormous pollution of the environment. The Cuyahoga River was so stuffed with chemicals, it was literally bursting into flames. The Potomac River was so sunk with nitrogen and phosphorus that there was algae in it that was killing the oxygen below the water surface and killing the fish. But it was also creating algae. If you put your arm in the Potomac River and you pulled it out, it was covered with green slime. People could see it, feel it, touch it. It was in our faces. And on Earth Day, 1970, April 22nd, 20 million Americans, 20 billion Americans, nearly 10% of the population of the country, went into the streets, went to college campuses, went to shopping malls, probably the Mall of New Hampshire, I don't know if it was built at that point, protesting the fouling of the air and the water. Unbelievable outpouring of protests. People were there, physically, saying, we will not put up with this, okay? Within a year, in 1971, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act, on and on and on, all signed by that great environmentalist, Richard Nixon. I happen to know quite well Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first head of the EPA. I did a documentary for PBS Frontline 4 years ago in 2009 called Poisoned Waters. I was looking at what had happened in the 35 years since the Clean Water Act, and I was interviewing people, among them Bill Ruckelshaus, and I asked him, I said, you know, Nixon, you don't think of him, we don't think of him, and there were titters in the audience, so you don't think of him either as a great environmentalist. I said, Bill, did he really care? I mean, what was going on here? Did I miss something? He said, well, I can tell you, he said, in all the years I worked for Richard Nixon, he never asked me once, Bill, is it bad out there? I mean, is the Cuyahoga River really bursting into flames? He said, he never said that. He said, the one thing he did say that I can remember very clearly was, he said, Bill, when you get over there to that agency, he said, don't get captured by those bureaucrats at EPA. EPA. Ruckelshaus said, Nixon was the only person in Washington who thought the nickname for the EPA was EPA. That's how much he cared and knew about the environment. I said, so why did he do it? He said he was a practical politician. The people were demanding action. We, the government, had to respond. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. Listen to that syllogism. The people demanded it. The government had to respond. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. Doesn't seem that way, quite that way right now. Okay, so that's what was going on. There was that powerful pressure from below. And there was the anti-Vietnam War protests. There were protests against nuclear weapons and calling for the nuclear test ban treaty. There were a whole lot of protests that had direct impact on government policies, not almost across the board, certainly in a whole variety of different areas. So people power mattered, and it affected power in Washington and decisions in Washington. What happened was, starting in the 1970s, earlier than most of us thought, certainly earlier than I thought, There was a shift in power that began. It was hidden for a long time, and then it has become much more evident to all of us. There was a reaction. It was a boss's revolt. It was a backlash from business in particular to all these citizen movements. There was a guy named Lewis Powell, whose name should be familiar to some of you at least. He was named to the Supreme Court in 1972 by Richard Nixon and served 15 or 16 years. But Powell was a corporate attorney, and before the time that Nixon had named him to the court, Powell was talking with some of his friends in the corporate world and at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he was complaining vehemently about the power of the trade unions, the power of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the consumer movement, and said business was getting killed in the political marketplace in Washington. They need to do something about it. And the people at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said to Powell, why don't you write us a memo? You were a lawyer, write us a brief. And that's what he did. Powell wrote what is now called by historians the Lewis Powell Memorandum of August 1971. And in it he said that the American free enterprise system was under mortal threat. You would have thought the communists were coming right over Bunker Hill and headed for New Hampshire on the basis of what he said. Certainly, business was on its heels politically. It was on the defensive. I don't know if the situation was as disastrous as he said, but that's what he said. And that's, as a matter of fact, business leaders responded to that. He said you have to identify your enemies, you have to go after them aggressively, you have to organize, you have to pool your money, and you have to have a long-term game plan to take the high ground in Washington and get policies that will help the free enterprise system. Well, I never knew anything about the Powell Memo. I ran the Washington Bureau in the New York Times in the late 70s and was the chief correspondent, bureau chief, well on into the 1980s. And I got to tell you, I didn't even know Powell had written a memo, and nor did anybody who worked for me. Nor did anybody who worked for the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the television networks. In fact, I gave a talk about a year ago to a bunch of journalists in Washington, including Bob Schieffer of Face the Nation, Jim Blair, PBS NewsHour, Mark Shields of the Washington Post. 40 or 50 of them, there was only one other reporter besides myself who had ever heard of the Powell Memo. It is such an important document that I've included the text of it in the back of the appendix of my book, Who Stole the American Dream. I think it's one of the most important documents of the last half century that is basically unknown to most people. Anyway, people responded to Powell's memo. The Chamber of Commerce circulated nationwide among business leaders. Within 4 months, the Business Roundtable had been formed. Okay, if you know American politics and you follow Washington, the Business Roundtable is the organization of the 150 largest 160, 170 largest corporations in America, the blue chip companies. And believe it or not, it didn't exist before the Powell Memo. It came into being in response to the Powell Memo, and it is enormous, has enormous clout in Washington today. It's CEOs who go down and lobby the president, the vice president, the people who stay in the Lincoln bedroom, people who talk to the Speaker of the House, people who talk to, thank you very much, Mr. Twain, people who talk to the Speaker of the House, Majority Leader of the Senate, Committee Chairman. They don't lobby down at the member level. Okay. Big clout. When Powell wrote his memo, there actually wasn't much business lobbying going on in Washington. There were only about 175 companies that even had offices in Washington. 8 years later, there were 2,000. There were 175 at that point. 8 years later, 2,425. There were 50,000 people before 1980 working for business trade associations. There were 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists. There were 8,000 corporate PR people. There was a veritable army. I call it Powell's Army. And what's interesting is, and what was really surprising to me, and I'm both excited to tell you this because it was a discovery to me as a reporter, and I'm embarrassed to tell you this because I didn't know it before, but the change came in American politics before Reagan took office. The change came under Jimmy Carter, when the Democrats were in control of both houses of Congress. What do I mean by the change? The change in policies, the change in the direction of American economic policies as determined by the government, as determined by Congress. When Jimmy Carter got elected, the trade union movement said, wow, we finally got a Democratic president. Nixon and Jerry Ford, the Republicans, are out of the White House. We're finally going to get the labor laws that we want, that will roll back Taft-Hartley and Landry Griffin and get some more ability to organize in places we'd like to organize around the country. Well, those laws got out of the House of Representatives, got passed by the House, but snuffed out in the Senate. They never got out of Congress. The lobbying there was very powerful. And Orrin Hatch of Utah had a killer filibuster against the labor laws in the Senate. Ralph Nader was thinking, well, we can get a Consumer Protection Bureau with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. That never even got out of the House. That got killed before it got out of the House. And then business went on the offensive. The first thing they did was put in the 401k plan. It was buried, almost nobody saw it. Think about it. Would you ever purposely name a program 401k? It was the 401st paragraph in the tax code, and it was subparagraph K. And nobody would even see it. It was stuck in as a tax shelter for the profit-sharing bonus program of Xerox and Kodak, who have home offices in Rochester, New York, and their Congressman Barbara Conable, a Republican, who was the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that writes tax laws, and so he put it in as a favor for them, and for half a dozen New York banks who wanted the same thing. It's never intended as a national retirement plan. I got a whole chapter on how that evolved and what it is today and whether or not it's working, and so forth. You can look at that. But trust me, it got slipped in there and got missed. The corporate bankruptcy law was changed in a way that put corporate management in charge of bankruptcy when corporations declared bankruptcy, which had an enormous impact when you had bankruptcies rolling through the steel industry in the 1990s and through the airline industry in the 2000s. And if you look at what happened, and I follow in particular the bankruptcy of United Airlines, the employees in the end gave up $4 billion worth of benefits, wages, health insurance, retirement benefits, and so forth, that were in their union contracts. It was a way to rip that up. So in terms of inequality of income, that law had a tremendous impact. Then Wall Street went to work on Congress in that particular Congress and said, look, we can't stand the limits on interest rates imposed by the state usury laws all around the country. We need to have Congress pass a law that overrules state usury laws and takes all limits off interest rates. And Congress did that in that particular Congress. Now that set the groundwork for the subprime crisis, because you couldn't have had the subprime crisis if there was any limit on interest rates, because the subprime crisis begins with the bank, it doesn't end that way, but it begins with the banks loaning to poor risk people and charging very high interest rates. By the way, the banks wanted to charge not 5 or 6 or 7 or 8%, they want to be able to charge 15 or 18 or 20%. Have you ever noticed what the charge is if you don't pay your full balance on your credit card today? And most of you, most of us, are good credit risk. You're paying that bad credit risk 18, 20, 22%. So once they got it in, they began to use it with all of us. Anyway, that got passed. We got deregulation of trucking and telecommunications. We got a reduction in the corporate tax rate. Carter had wanted to increase the corporate tax rate in order to help balance the budget, but when the lobbyists got done with that, particularly the corporate lobbyists got done with that, they reduced the tax rate a couple of percentage points. Not a big difference in numbers, but a big difference in the direction in which the taxes were moving. And also, in that same Congress, we got the largest single decrease in the capital gains rate. The capital gains rate in '78 was reduced from 48% to 28%, 20 points. Single biggest change. So when I go back and I look at history, and I sort of say, where is that moment that's equivalent to the fourth quarter pass interceptions in a Patriots game, or that service break when Rafael is is playing Federer. You know, one of those tennis matches where you suddenly see the game change because there's been a service break. That's what happened in this Congress. What happened was it was a game changer. The psychology of the politics and the landscape of power in Washington began to shift, and we've had that same landscape of power ever since. And what you've seen is steadily the decline of interest rates. Do you remember this? The maximum marginal tax rate under Eisenhower was 92%, Kennedy 77%, Wade quite a long time, Reagan 35%, and it bounces around 35% more recently. But at the same time, the payroll tax funding Social Security and Medicare is coming up from 3.65% up to 7.65%. So the tax that everybody pays, the poorest workers, the people who actually are making poverty wages, $10,000 a year, their taxes have doubled, but the taxes on the people at the top have come down. And the taxes on the states for the top 1 or 2%. Sorry if somebody's in this room, but the taxes have come down. The exemption for estates has gone way up from $1 million a year, $1 million for a state to $10 million for an estate. But the minimum wage is still stuck down at a level that's below where it was in 1968, you start to wonder why there are these great inequalities of income. The income tax reductions that were enacted under Reagan added $1 trillion to the wealth of the top 1% each decade since it was enacted. $3 trillion. And the tax cuts enacted under Bush added another $1 trillion to the wealth of the top 1%. In fact, over the last 42 years, from 1979 to 2011, in the private sector, before taxes, 84% of all the gains in the nation's income, the entire nation's monetary income, 84% of the gains went to the top 1%. If you look at the period from 2000 to 2007, the gains in income went 100% to the top 1%. And in 2011, they went 101% to the top 1%. You say, how is that possible? There's only 100%. The answer is the other 99% of us actually lost ground. We went down 100%. So if you're wondering again about this lopsided reward system that we have going on now, the way we're cutting the pie, it's enormous. And then it's added to by these governmental policies. So that's what happened in the political arena. What happened in the economic arena is a very interesting, important, and somewhat difficult to understand entirely, shift in the mindset and the ethics of business leaders in this country. If you go back, and I was surprised to do this, and I learned a lot by doing this. If you go back and start to look at what was said by leaders like Charlie Wilson at General Motors and Reg Jones at General Electric and Frank Abrams at Standard Oil of New Jersey about the obligations and duty and responsibilities and the outlook, the economic philosophy of the leaders of America's greatest corporations, they believed that it was their job to balance the economic interests of the stakeholders in the corporation. Stakeholders is an enormously important word. What they meant was all the groups that had a stake in the success of that corporation. Now, obviously, that includes the owners. It also includes the managers, the executives. It includes the rank and file employees. It includes the suppliers, the creditors, the customers. You're a customer of a company, you don't want the company to go out of business. You don't want Apple not to be able to fix your phone, or Mercedes-Benz not to be able to fix your car, or whoever it is you buy your refrigerator from not to be able to fix that, stand behind the guarantee. You have an interest, you have a stake in the survival of that company. That's what these guys believed. And they believed that it was, and I even have seen the words, it is our sacred trust to balance these interests. Now, they didn't do that just out of nobility. They believed it was smart business. They believed it was good economics. Henry Ford had said way back in 1914, if I pay my workers a $5 a day, which at that time was a munificent sum, it was a lot of money, it's like $20 an hour for rank and file workers, they're going to be able to afford to buy the Model T cars that Ford Motor Company is making. And that's the same thing that Charlie Wilson and Reg Jones and those other guys said decades later. If we pay our workers well, they can buy our products, and that will drive the economy. Economists call that the virtuous circle of growth. And every part of this process is important. It's a circle because each part of the process forces the next process. If you produce a lot and you sell it, and people are making good, tens of millions of people are making good earnings, middle-class Americans, and when I say middle class, I'm talking about the 180 million Americans whose salary today runs between, household income today runs between $30,000 and $110,000 a year. That's 60% of America. If you're above that, we're already starting to get into upper middle class. If you're above $250,000 a year, you're already in the top 2%. If you're above $383,000, you're in the top 1%. A lot of people don't know those numbers, and sort of almost everybody in America says I'm middle class. People are making $20,000 and people are making $250,000. Obviously, they're sort of different ends of the economic spectrum, but they all call themselves middle class. Economists try to find some way to identify this in economic terms. Anyway, what's going on is this distribution has begun to shift in terms of the rewards going to the people in different parts of the economic spectrum here. And when you start to take a look at how the rewards get parceled out, I mentioned earlier that as the productivity of the American workforce rose at the end of World War II, 97%, the median household income went up 95%. But if you move forward to the latest period, from 1975 to 2011, The productivity of the American workforce rose 80%. Still a very impressive achievement, although most of us thought it would be even better than before because we had the digital revolution. It's still very impressive. But median household income went up only 10%. 80%, 10%, 97%, 95%. And the main reason it went up 10% is that more women were working more hours, or couples were putting more hours per family into the workforce. If you look at men alone, compare apples to apples, in 2011, the median male worker in America got hourly compensation that was identical to what he got in 1978. 30 years of absolutely dead even, right where they were before. CEO pay went up about 350% over that period. The incomes of the people at the top 1% went up 600% during that period. That's in the private sector. And add to that the impact of the tax increases, and you begin to understand why Citigroup says we have the greatest inequality of any. So you had a power shift and you had a mind shift that has changed the way the economic pie in America is cut up and delivered. And now we have a problem. We have a problem that goes beyond people's sense of it sort of being unfair. Are we disturbed as Americans about inequality of income? I think not. I think we accept the idea that different people come with talent, some people work hard, some people are lazy, some people move around from jobs and aren't steady, other people are steady, some people get a better education and not only have an education but they keep educating themselves. We have this idea that people should be rewarded more for hard work, for talent, for inventing things and so forth. But there's also a sense there's a point at which it gets out of proportion. It's kind of like obscenity. There's no absolute definition for it, but when you see it, you know it, okay? We see it and we know it. It's gotten out of hand. But there's something else that's important. It's very clear from economic studies that when you have high inequality of income, you have low growth. When you have high inequality of income, you have low growth. I read studies about different periods of American history and see the word high inequality of income is, quote, destructive to growth. I've seen others that say it's a drag on growth. I've seen others that say it slows growth down. But there's pretty much a unanimous opinion that high inequality of income is bad for growth. So all of us are paying a price for that. And we're paying a price in the jobs that are being generated and the jobs that aren't being generated. So it isn't just that the people who are down there stuck making $10,000 a year or making $30,000 a year in household income, that they're suffering. They are. And they can't afford to send their kids to college. Their incomes may have kept up over the last 35 years with inflation, okay? So you can say, well, they can still afford the same clothes, they can still afford gasoline, cars, whatever. But if you look at the big ticket items, if you look at the cost of medical care, if somebody has somebody really sick in the family or a disaster, it's gone up much faster than inflation. Inflation in medical care costs is much higher. If you look at the cost of college education, it's gone up much faster. And if you look at the cost of buying a house, it's gone up much faster. I'm talking about over 30 or 40 years. So all the big ticket items that every family's got to cope with have gotten beyond the reach of the middle class family, and the median household income in America today is roughly $50,000. That's with two people or one person, whatever it is. Whatever the family brings in, $50,000 is just about the middle. When you start to think about families with two kids, trying to buy a house, trying to send somebody to college, trying to take care of kids with child care, trying to handle their transportation costs, you begin to understand why middle America is under such stress. And then you add to that the fact that we now have 21.5 million people in America who do not have full-time jobs and who want them. They're either unemployed officially because they're looking and they can't find them, or they've gotten discouraged and they've dropped out, or there are 8 or 9 million have part-time jobs and they want full-time jobs. So question now, what do we do? What do we do about this predicament? How do we reclaim the dream for them and for the country? Well, I have to say, when my editor said to me, Rick, you got to tell us how to reclaim the dream in this book of yours. You've written a book and you've gotten us in this ditch and you've described how we got in this quagmire. You've got to get us out. My initial response was, look, Kate, her name is Kate Medina, at Random House, I said, Kate, I'm a reporter. My job is to go and get the facts, tell the facts, call balls and strikes, call foul and fair, but I'm not a policy guy. That's up to the president, that's up to think tanks, that's up to academics, that's up to voters, that's up to everybody. She said, no, you got to do it. And we went back and forth. And then my chief editor stepped in. My first reader, a woman named Susan Zox, is a woman I've been with for 30 years, my wife. And she said, Rick, Kate's right, you got to do it. So I did it. So the last 2 chapters of my book are Hedrick Smith's handy-dandy 10-point plan to save America. And I say it kind of frivolously that way because I'm embarrassed. Because I'm a guy who worked for the New York Times for 26 years and studiously never read the editorial page because I did not want to know what the opinion people thought so I could do my job as a reporter straight without being influenced by the paper's editorial policy. So here I'm in the editorial policy. What am I doing here? Very awkward, okay? But there's some things that we can do that are pretty obvious. They're going to be disputed, but a lot of them have bipartisan support. Not from everybody. It's pretty hard to get some people's agreement to anything. The Chamber of Commerce says we have a transportation system in America. Ports, seaports, railroads, bridges, highways, that is so out of date. Remember, it was built at the time of Dwight Eisenhower, 1958. I mean, you all know where the potholes are, and you know the highways to avoid and how expensive. You know, it needs to be refurbished. The Chamber of Commerce says we've lost $1 trillion in economic growth because our transportation system is so inadequate, so aged. Okay? So one thing we could do would be to modernize our transportation system and spend some money on that. Put some government seed money in, but basically, there are lots of places in Wall Street who would like to invest in rebuilding the infrastructure, but they want some government guarantees. They want the government to trigger this thing. And people will say, well, that's the government picking winners and losers in the American economy. That's not American. Let's go back and think about American history. The Erie Canal was built with government money. Samuel F. B. Morse set up his first telegraph system with a $30,000 appropriation from Congress. Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, got Congress to appropriate land and money for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and that opened up the West, and there was an enormous economic boom thanks to that. Teddy Roosevelt got Congress to fund the development of the inland waterways in America in the early part of the 20th century. Dwight Eisenhower, as I mentioned, got Congress to fund the building of the interstate highway system. All 3 of those are Republican presidents. I haven't even mentioned what Democratic presidents have done. The idea that it's un-American to have the government help stimulate or support or engender the growth and the improvement of the national transportation system just simply doesn't accord with our historical record. So that's something we could do. It would generate jobs. It would make us more competitive, and it would help, particularly at this point in the nation's economic development with globalization and competition from abroad. We could make our corporate tax system more rational. At the moment, we have a corporate tax system on the books that charges corporations 35% of their earnings. It's one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And it's terrible if corporations actually pay that. But most corporations pay nothing like that. We had 78 major corporations who made tens of billions of dollars of profit from 2008 to 2010, and they paid 0 federal taxes. In fact, one of them, General Electric, got $4.8 billion back as a tax refund from the government. So something else is at work. What's at work is $1.2 trillion in corporate tax loopholes. But the biggest and the worst loophole for us, for jobs in America, is the loophole that lets corporations make profits abroad and pay a lower tax on profits made overseas than in America. It's crazy. That's an incentive for people to move jobs out of the country. What happens under the tax system now is if you make profits in America, if you get some other loopholes, maybe you don't pay 35%, maybe you pay 30% or 28%, but you pay a pretty high tax rate. But if you've got profits that you make mostly overseas, and the big multinationals are now making bigger profits overseas than they're making back in America, you are allowed to deduct the cost of those operations overseas from your domestic profits, but you pay 0 taxes on your profits overseas until the moment that you bring them back to America, at which point you are theoretically supposed to pay 35%. But what happens is that lots of major corporations, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, General Electric, you name a whole slew of them, make profits overseas, and then they get together, as they did in 2005, and they say to the government, look, and they had $1 trillion in accumulated corporate profits overseas in 2005. They said to the government, to the George Bush administration and to Congress, look, we'll bring that money back to America and we'll help generate jobs in America if you'll give us what they called a tax holiday. Well, what they negotiated was a tax holiday, which was a 5.5% tax rate on all that money they brought back. So not 35%, but 5.5%. Okay? They said we're going to invest that in jobs in America, and the administration and Congress bought it. Great idea, we need jobs in America. Okay. Right now, J.P. Morgan says there are $1.7 trillion in corporate tax profits sitting overseas. And the corporations are organizing again right now to get another tax holiday to bring that money back. And they're saying, once again, we're going to generate jobs in America. Well, some economists said, before we do that, why don't we go back and check and see what actually happened to the $1 trillion that were brought back in 2005. And what they found out was that 92% of that $1 trillion went to dividends to stockholders, went to buying back stock in the companies, which would drive the price up, which would benefit the owners, and went to bonuses for executives. And 8% went to generating jobs in America. So people are now saying, okay, let's fix it, but you're coming back this time, and we'll take 20% and we're going to check on it. Now, my thought is this: if we need to modernize our infrastructure, why don't we say to those corporations, you can bring back $1.7 trillion, you can pay a 20% tax on those, and the rest of the money you can invest in building our infrastructure. And you will have dividends from that. If there are toll roads, if there are fees that come from airports, if there are fees that come from the new facilities, you can actually get a return. We're not going to take the money away from you, but we're going to insist that it goes into improving the national economy and actually generates jobs in America. So there's a couple of ideas. There are a whole slew. I got a chapter of it. But I want to tell you that I really think what makes all the difference, and the economic stuff is not going to happen if we don't fix our political system. We got a political system that is dominated by money. We know it. And we don't even know whose money it is recently. So we need to start doing some things. There are 16 states. New Hampshire's not one of them, I don't believe. There are 16 states that have now passed resolutions calling for the overturn of Citizens United decision that said corporations and trade unions and institutions like that are people, and therefore they can donate unlimited amounts of money to political campaigns. That has caused a firestorm across America, and I suspect there may be some people in this room who are concerned about that. That's one thing we can do. That's a very cumbersome process. There are bills in Congress now calling for a constitutional amendment that would effectively overturn it by giving Congress the power to regulate campaign contributions. That may be a long process, but it's underway. Another way to go on that is public financing of campaigns. If you listen to politicians talk, what they will say is the cost of television ads in particular, but the cost of campaigns has skyrocketed so much in the last decade, the last 15 years, that the money advantage in campaigns can be overwhelming. At the moment, walking around, traveling around New Hampshire, I've been told that there are members, Republican members of the Senate in New Hampshire, who are afraid to make compromises with Democrats because they're afraid that somebody's going to come in with a bundle of money and a Tea Party candidate to compete with them in the primary, in the Republican primary, and they won't be able to compete because they won't be able to raise that much money. The Club for Growth, Freedom Works, the Koch brothers, there are other people. And this doesn't just happen on the Republican side, it happens on the Democratic side too. The danger is that we've taken the competition out of a lot of our campaigns, and that big money can come in, and particularly in Congress, even more than in the presidential race, that big money can come in and absolutely dominate the race, and it can make our political system work terribly. It can push people to the extremes. So people are saying if we get public financing, particularly if we get public financing for candidates who raise small donations, match the small donations, people who give 10, 15, 25, 50, $100, say up to $100 or up to $200, match them 3 to 1. So there's a floor underneath. So every candidate has a certain amount of money. Then the money advantage isn't that large, and you have competitive races. Competitive races give voters power. Uncompetitive races deny voters power. So if you want voter power, that's the theory behind public financing. The second thing we've got to fix is gerrymandering. I think I mentioned it before. I asked the kids today at Nashua High School, true or false? Today we can predict the outcome of 90% of the races in the House of Representatives in 2014 before a single ballot is cast. True or false?
True.
I got a split, about 50-50. The answer is true. Why is the answer true? Because 90% of the districts in Congress have been so gerrymandering they are totally safe. The incumbent does not have to worry about losing that race except potentially in the primary. Primaries have become a replacement now for the general election. In a general election, we're lucky to get a 50% turnout. In a primary, we're lucky to get a 25% turnout. I'm talking about 25% of the total adult electorate. And you can win a primary, particularly if there's more than two candidates, you can win a primary with 10 or 11% of the vote. Is that representative? I don't know. I don't think it is. And having those safe seats not only guarantees incumbents their office for a long, long time to come. What it does is it begins to eliminate the political middle. My theme in economics is we've got to restore the middle class. We've got to bring the middle class back to make America work again effectively, economically. In politics, we've got to bring the middle back to begin to get the grounds and the lubrication in the system to reach the compromises which enable Congress and the President to work together. We need the middle. What happens is when you have safe districts, they go more and more extreme. And what you have when you get the elections over, you get people in Washington, as you see today, who can't talk to each other. They're shouting across the Grand Canyon to each other. We need to restore the middle. There's another way to restore the middle. And that is being experimented with in California and Washington State. And that is single primaries with the top two vote getters going into the general election. Sounds a little odd when you first hear it. I know you all have the option in New Hampshire of voting in one or the other of the presidential primaries, particularly if you're an independent. I guess you can change your party registration in order to vote in the one you want. What they do out there is they say everybody runs in the same primary. Democrats, Republicans, Green, Free Staters, Libertarians, you name it. And everybody votes in the same primary. And then the top two go into the general election. Well, usually that's a Democrat and a Republican. But in the last elections in California, there were 6 congressional districts in which, in which 2 Democrats ran against each other. And there were districts in Washington where 2 Democrats ran against each other. Now, why would you say that's important? Why does that help restore the middle? Well, think about it. If you have everybody voting in the same mix, then candidates have got to think about appealing to people on the other side of the aisle. They got to think about appealing to independents and moderates. And in Washington State, the first thing that happened when they did this in 2010, the turnout in every single one of their 9 congressional districts went up 20% or more. Why? Because a whole lot of people who'd given up voting because there were safe districts and it didn't make any sense to vote before, decided it was worth getting back into the political process. If that happens, then the campaign managers who write the political ads that used to make everybody hate each other in order to mobilize the base have to start thinking about how do I do it without alienating the other side. You start forcing politicians to deal with a larger electorate, a more balanced electorate. So those are the kinds of things that we have to think about. And finally, it's only going to happen if we go back to the kind of citizen activism we had in the 60s and 70s. It's only going to happen when people like yourselves, people in this room and rooms like this all across the country. And I said the same thing to the kids at Plymouth State and UNH, and the same thing to the kids at Nashua High School this morning. It's only going to change if we get involved. People in power now, the power structure today in Washington, it's not going to change. The people down there like it the way it is. They may complain against each other, they shout against each other, but both the political parties actually like it. It's very hard to get them to change. This is the system they got in office on. This is the system that's kept them in office. It's only if we who are unhappy with it say, hey, this is unacceptable. It's got to change. The last 6 words of my book are, we the people must take action. I believe that. The time has come. Toynbee's told us. Lincoln's told us. The time's later. We the people must take action. Thanks. think you're onto something very important. I think there are people all over the country, and frankly, I've talked to audiences now, from the bottom and from trade unions to management groups. I'm going to a meeting of the conference board in New York next week. They've asked me to come participate with CEOs of major companies. I think people at every level of this country. I've talked to the 1%, I've talked to the 0.1%. I've talked to an audience where there probably wasn't a single couple in the audience whose net worth was less than $100 million. And even in that group, they don't agree necessarily with everything I'm saying, but even in that group there's a concern. Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think the Tea Party people began. People have taken advantage of the Tea Party movement and they're manipulating and they're controlling it for their own political purposes. But I think the urge was what I was talking about. The middle class is lost. They feel disenfranchised, they feel economically absolutely overwhelmed, and in the case of the Tea Party, there's a tendency to blame the government. It's the government that's too big, this government's taking too much of our money. They see the government as the biggest thing. But I think there's a real failure to understand the economic dynamics that I've laid out, but others have laid out as well. I'm not unique in this field. And this is not to say I'm absolutely right and they're absolutely wrong. But I do think that we in the media have failed to connect the dots for people, and I think there's grievous misunderstanding, and then there's some very deliberate misleading stuff being put out in the public. For example, that if you lower the taxes on the rich, you get higher growth. Well, I think our historical record shows the opposite. But I think you're right. The bellyache that a lot of people, that pulled a lot of people to the Tea Party and to that protest is the same one. We're sinking, we're in trouble, we got to do something about it, we got to lash out. And we're lashing out with that kind of anger.
That you delivered to the national students, the same as the one you've just given us.
Absolutely.
Why isn't there a difference?
What?
Why isn't there a difference?
Why should there be? I'm not going to say something different to students that I would say, well, that would be disrespectful. I respect their intelligence. I respect where they're going. You know, I'm trying to find the level at which, if you're asking me, did I put it differently? Did I talk about it differently? Did I try to find ways to make it intelligible to teenagers as opposed to people like you and me who have white hair and have lived through this? Sure, I'm not a dope, but the message was the same. The analysis was the same. And I began with a questionnaire which was intended to help them stop and think about the very issues that I'm talking about in my speech. So, no, my message to them was no different. Well, I asked my colleagues, they were there, they heard it. You know, every speech I give is different. I don't talk, you can see, I don't talk from a text. I barely even talk from notes unless I'm reading a quote from somebody. So this stuff was in my head, but I use it. I mean, I talked to women making a difference yesterday. I started talking with them about the women's movement. Last night I was talking with people at AFL-CIO, and I started talking with them, you know, about the labor movement. And if I'm talking in universities and I'm talking to a sociology class, I'm talking about, is America still a land of opportunity? And are we having the upward mobility that we used to have? Because they study mobility. So I try to find a way to connect with a particular audience, but the basic analysis, the basic message I'm giving is the same. I mean, I'm a journalist, I'm not a politician trying to cater to audiences. I mean, I gave the same audience, same message to the top 1%. I didn't sugarcoat it. Some of them didn't like it, but we talked back and forth. And what was interesting to me was they're worried about America. They're worried about the inequality of income. They think something has to be done about it. And they also think, well, somebody else has got to demand it. We're not going to automatically surrender it. Okay? All right, I think I want to get a woman over here. Please.
Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Louder.
Thank you for coming tonight.
It's my pleasure.
You know, I would appreciate your perspective on a question that I have.
Hold the mic
Point it right in your mouth, like this, almost like an ice cream cone.
Okay.
There you go.
I would appreciate your perspective on a question that I've always had, and you touched upon it, but I would love your opinion as to why it is not comprehended and then followed through with finding a solution as to why we pay such a poor minimum wage and what you think it will take for people to make a living wage in this country.
Well, I think the question, did everybody hear it? Was that good enough? The question about the minimum wage is an interesting and very telling one. In the first place, one of the arguments against raising the minimum wage that is argued repeatedly is that if you raise the minimum wage, there are going to be some businesses that are going to go out of business, or they're not going to be able to keep those people on the payroll. People are going to lose jobs. It's going to have a negative economic impact, okay? And there is some truth to that, but that's a misleading half-truth. There may actually be some businesses that go out of business. There may actually be some people who lose their jobs because those employers can't pay them more. But in fact, when you look at the general economic situation, most employers, the overwhelming majority of employers, go along with the rise in the minimum wage. And what that does is it creates more purchasing power on the part of those families, and that additional purchasing power goes into the economy, and in fact, it engenders more jobs. It creates more jobs. You can take a look at the example of the state right next to you in Vermont. They have one of the highest minimum wages in the country, and they have one of the lowest unemployment rates. And you can go to Mississippi, and they have one of the lowest minimum wages in the country, and they have one of the highest unemployment rates. So when you actually look at the way it plays out over a bit of time, there is no connection between the unemployment rate and the minimum wage. Now, if you jumped it from $7.25 an hour to $20 an hour, of course. But almost always when we've raised the minimum wage in America, we've done it on a graduated basis. Normally, Congress will say, we'll raise the minimum wage from $7.25, which is what it is now, to $10.25 an hour over 3 years. So we'll do $1 an hour each year. Okay? So, but it's very difficult to do that. It's difficult to pass a budget in Congress now. It's difficult to get Congress to do anything. I mean, that smacks of government regulation. You have a significant body of the Republican House that simply will not agree to any increase in any governmental regulation or activity, and you have a Speaker of the House who is so weak that he can't lead the House to a compromise, even if he put the bill to raise the minimum wage to a vote in the House, and it would pass. But it would pass probably with 197 Democratic votes and 50 or 60 Republican votes. And he doesn't want to do that. It's embarrassment to him. So we've got a political kind of deadlock. We've got a political, Russians call it tupik. We've got a dead end here where we're having trouble. That's one of the reasons why I think we have to get at these political reforms that begin to break open these safe districts and start to get competitive races where people's opinion can begin to re-influence the people who are exercising power on our behalf. I want to say, my colleagues, just a sec, one of my colleagues have a clipboard around here. I'm interested in helping and communicating with people who are interested in getting involved and getting re-engaged. So if you find somebody passing a sheet around, that's what it's about. And it's not to push a particular agenda, it's not to push a particular party, it is simply to encourage people to get back involved the way we were before. Way in the back of the room, please.
I just have one question for you. When do we all stop marching? I'm ready.
You ready? All right.
Yvonne Brown. And I've already marched in '64 in the Civil Rights March. I went to Washington this year because my civil rights to vote was been questioned in the Supreme Court. And I'm telling you all in this room, your rights are steadily going down. You gotta get out in the street and you gotta march. I don't care if you take a bus, boat, plane, I don't care how you do it. We have to go to Washington. We have to organize. It is late. It is already past due. We have to go out in the street and march. We have to tell them in Washington, this is our country, right now.
On that same note, I was active in the 60s. We all saw the marches of the Civil Rights Movement. I was very aware of all of that. My father was an Episcopalian minister. In those days, if there was a big march like the march in Boston that we participated in, the media covered it. Everybody in the country saw what was going on, the Civil Rights Movement and all that. Now, if there's a march on Washington, it doesn't even get in the newspaper, it doesn't get on the internet. Nobody even knows about it. So as a journalist, this is a very important thing, is that citizen action needs to be taken notice of. If it's all covered up by the media, which is all owned by these big corporations anyway, and nobody reports on these marches, then where are we? And I think this is what's happening to a lot of young people in this country, is they don't see the value in citizen action. They should be taken.
Okay, that's a fair question, and it's a fair criticism. But I would remind you there was a 50th anniversary march on Washington, which this lady said she took part in, and it was reported in the media. There were several 100,000 people demonstrating in the Bay Area against the war in Vietnam, and it was reported in the San Francisco media and nationally. We only know about Occupy and the Tea Party because the media has been reporting them. So, was there less reporting than you would have liked? I'm sure. Was there any reporting and were people notified? Yes, they were. We wouldn't know about those movements if they hadn't been reported. So, and I've got to tell you, there were lots of times when I covered the civil rights movement in the South, and I went and I looked around, and there were no other reporters there. There were times when I was the only reporter there, and there were people saying, where the heck are all the other reporters? They're ignoring us. So it's not new that people who are involved in activist movements feel as though the press is ignoring them. But what happened in the civil rights movement is they hung in there, and it kept going. And part of what happened, I mean, let's face it, the strategy of nonviolence was a brilliant strategy. The answer was, if they attack you, don't attack back. The answer is, if Bull Cotter, the Birmingham police commissioner, sicks the police dogs on you and turns the fire hoses at you, you turn your collar up, you turn your cheek, you don't reply, and when the nation sees that, it's outrage. Now, what happened with Occupy? And you know, the argument was there are rats infesting the park and there are all kinds of problems there. It got covered for quite a while. I think the Occupy movement is something worth looking at. I'm willing to respond to that because I have some comments about the Occupy movement. But let me just say, you know, your comments about, was there full coverage? No. Was there all the coverage you would like? No. Was there plenty of coverage? I believe there was, and you and I probably disagree about that. But should you hang on and keep going? Yes. Okay? As the woman says. Let me see if I can another woman. Thank you.
I wonder if you've done any research on the rise of family homelessness.
You want to? Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you've done anything or done any research on the rise of family homelessness. Back in the 70s, I don't remember families being homeless, and suddenly by the late 80s, there were family shelters all over Boston and up here too.
Sure. It's a terrible problem, and I have to acknowledge that in my book, it's not a subject that I address. There are all kinds of subjects dealing with poverty that I don't address. My thesis was that if the country is not taking care of the middle class, there's no way it's going to be taking care of people in true poverty. And I've got a very long book dealing with a whole lot of subjects. That's a subject I'd like to get into, but no, ma'am, I haven't done justice to that subject. But it's a very important subject. I agree with you. Yes.
Rick, I think you knew my cousin Jim Markham. My point to you is as I read the title behind you there, and I know that you scare a lot of traditional New Hampshire Republicans. A friend of mine said, no, I'm not going to raise my blood pressure. I'm thinking, well, why is that? Is it the facts that Ricks are giving, or is it the conclusions he drew from them? I've got to think that it's really the first, and just stay on message and stay with those kids in Tennessee and keep doing it over and over. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Well, I have to tell you, I had a great discussion with my publisher because when I decided I wanted to shift the title, you can imagine the publisher says, you know, you're going to offend people, you're going to scare people. Now let it be clear. Let it be clear to you and let it be clear to your friends. There are lots of business leaders that I praise in that book. There are a lot of business leaders that I single out and say are doing something smart. One of the smartest things that's going on in America today, and a story that's being missed by a lot of the media, is that in the wake of the auto bailout, the management of General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and the leadership of the United Auto Workers Union are sitting down trying to figure out together how they can generate more jobs at a profitable way for the companies. The companies, the management of the companies, came to the unions and said, we want to build our production back in America. We want to build our market share back in America. But we can't do it if we have to pay new workers the same wages that we're paying the current workers. Now, you know, in the union movement, that is anathema to have two wage scales. But the union leadership said, all right, we'll do that. We'll allow you to have a lower wage scale for new workers, provided we have an escalator clause that over a period of 7 or 8 years, they'll work their way up to the regular level, provided that you will agree that you will close production plants in Mexico and bring jobs back to America. And they agreed on that. So we now have some instances where labor and management are working together in an intelligent way that serves the interests of both, where each is making a sacrifice for the benefit of both and for the benefit of the whole. So I'm singling out people like that, okay? I compare Costco and Walmart. It's very important. Walmart is a hirer that gives very low pay, that counts on high flushing through, fast turnover of employees, low benefits, and high return to the shareholders. And by the way, 50% plus, more than 50% of the shares of Walmart are owned by the Walton family, the heirs of Sam Walton. There is nothing that can be done in that company without the approval of that family, and 4 members of that family are among the 11 richest people in America, and they have control of wealth that is equal to the bottom 40%, the entire bottom 40%, 120 million people in America. Right next to them, competing with them, is Costco, run by a guy named Jim Sinegal. And Jim Sinegal says, when Walmart says we cannot afford health benefits for our workers, Jim Sinegal of Costco says we have a moral obligation to give health care to our workers, because otherwise we'll dump them on Medicaid, we'll dump them on the emergency rooms of hospitals, and we owe it to those people, their families, and our community. And guess what? The CEO of Walmart takes a $20 million a year salary, and the CEO of Costco takes a $2 million salary. So I got both of those guys in there. So if your business friends are afraid of taking a look at that, I can't do anything about it. But if they want to play the game shareholder way, I'm going to call it shareholder. It's a ball. If they want to play it, stakeholder way, it's a strike, and I will call it a strike. Okay?
One more question. 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Yes, man with the big hat.
And a handsome dress.
And a big hat and a handsome dress. And it's not Betty Hall.
It is. Oh, Betty Hall.
I'm wearing the hat that Lenny D wore. This is her dress that she gave to me. So I'm very proud to be here, and I'm proud to have a chance to ask Hedrick Smith if he would confirm what he said about the campaign Citizens United when he talked to WMD last night. And I want to tell you that I was with Granny D when she heard about the Citizens United decision, and what she said was, that's my whole life going away.
That's my whole life
We cannot let that happen. We cannot let that happen. And I think that your remarks were very appropriate. Would you repeat them, please?
Oh God, my teacher's here and I can't remember what my homework was. I'm sure I said something like, 16 states have passed some kind of resolution that calls for the repeal of Citizens United or a constitutional amendment that would give Congress the power to regulate campaign finance, because the Supreme Court keeps overruling or punching holes in the campaign finance rules and legislation that were passed back in the 1970s. I don't believe that New Hampshire is one of those states, and it's a pregnant moment. I mean, if that woman in the back was saying it's time to march on Washington, I don't want to say it's time to march on Concord. It's up to you to say it's time to march on Concord. I'm not a citizen of New Hampshire, but you might give that some thought. That's a very, very important issue. And if that's how you feel about it, then by all means be my guest. I don't know if that's what I said, Betty Hall, but that's what I'm saying tonight. One more question. Yes, sir.
There's been some talk, and thanks to your book, there's been some talk, thanks to your book, about what it would take to turn the country around philosophically and to go back to the period of time. And somebody said on the other day on the radio that the turnaround will come not because of our efforts, although that'll be very important, but because there'll be somebody will take power, and they've done it in American history at given times that have done this. They go back to, they say it happens every 20 years. The two people they talk about, or that I remember, they go back all the way back to this particular report. They go back to the job that Lincoln did to bring equalization and do all sorts of things in his prayer. And then of course they got to Teddy Roosevelt and what he did to break up the big monopolies and to change the monopoly laws and to really make the first major change over there. Point is your movement got enough ammunition, or are you getting enough encouragement that you think that somebody is going to make it a major?
Well, essentially your question, if I read it right, I'm not going to go through all the details, but correct me if I'm wrong. Your question really is there going to be a turnaround until we get a leader of the caliber of Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt? Some other people would add Franklin Roosevelt on the other side of the aisle. Is it going to take a leader? My fear is that if we wait for a leader, we're not going to get a leader. I mean, leaders come out of popular movements that are pushing for something. And I'm worried that if we say, let's wait for a great leader, it's an excuse for the rest of us to sit on our duffs and watch television and cheer the Red Sox on, which is a noble cause, of course. I happen to be for the Detroit Tigers, so it was a suffering week for me. But seriously, I think it's a grave danger. We're a democracy. A democracy works from below. If you think of the current situation in America for a moment, and you imagine that we've got a federal government that is largely frozen into gridlock, it is going to take leadership from the states, from New Hampshire and California and Washington and Minnesota and Ohio, and hopefully occasionally in North Carolina or Florida. But it's going to take leadership from the states, and that actually happened. If you think of the period leading up to the New Deal, there was reform going on in Wisconsin. Bob LaFollette was going on in Minnesota, and there was reform going on in Oregon. I think this actually could be the era of the states again, and it could be another decade before we see the kind of change you're talking about at the national level. But in the meantime, we may actually see some very significant things going on in the states. So I would encourage you, don't sit on your hands, get involved, do it now, do it here. Thanks.